2, 1. Okay, good morning, and whether you're watching this live or as a recording, welcome to our show and tell. Today we're going to be presenting updates on the Reduce and Invalid Planning Applications project, otherwise known as RIPA, and the Back Office Planning System project, also known as BOPS. My name is Freya Cunningham, and I'm a Planning Officer at Southwark Council. I'll be introducing the agenda for today's presentation and closing up at the end of the event. Just as a quick reminder, the RIPA and BOPS projects are run by a partnership which includes Southwark, Lambeth and Buckinghamshire councils, the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and developers Open System Labs and Unboxed. If it is your first time hearing about these projects, then RIPA is a new planning application system and BOPS is a new back office system for validating and assessing planning applications. You're able to find out more details about the history of these projects, including recordings of all previous show and tells on the 2 websites shown here. Okay, so onto the agenda for today. Over the next 45 minutes, we will be looking at work completed over the past 4 weeks, which covers the period since our last show and tell. First up is the team from Open Systems Labs to talk about RIPA analytics, digital land integration and decision points. And they'll also be looking at a high-level RIPA roadmap to explain the next steps for the project. We're then going to hear from Alice at Mensa to talk about the ongoing work to improve the consistency and language of help text within RIPA, and also from the Unboxed team on their work mapping prior approval stories and creating more working parts of the validation wizard within BOPS. And we'll also hear from Stephen at Lambeth about our testing with officers. Just as a reminder, before we get into the main updates, if you're watching us live, then we'd love to take any questions you have. If you look to the right side of your screen, you'll see there's a box that you can type your question into, and then we'll return to those at the end of the presentation. So with all that in mind, let's get going and pass on to our first speaker for today, Alistair from Open System Labs.
Thanks, Freya. Thanks very much. Okay, so yeah, a few things we're going to I'm going to just talk about that we've been working on over the last month, that are just sort of picking some of the most interesting things, really. So one of them is a really nice piece of work, which I quite liked, which is to do with avoiding noise in our analytics. So obviously, as regular viewers of this series will remember that we built behind the planning services, we've built an analytics engine, so which allows us to see how users are using the service, which is obviously incredibly useful because we can see the journeys that different users are taking, but perhaps even more importantly, where they're falling off, right? Where they're getting stuck or where they're having issues, etc., etc. So and what kind of results they have, and measuring the impact that we have in terms of some of the goals that we want, in terms of we want people to be able to get better quality information, and we can see that that's happening. We want to be able to be reducing the number of invalid planning applications and general failure demand. So these are incredibly useful. So what you can see here, for example, is some of the dashboard of the analytics of the find out if you need planning permission. Southwark's find out if you need planning permission service. So you can so we can kind of see generally, not a specific person's data, but generally what people are doing. But the problem with it is that if we say look across at one of the other services like the LDC service, we as a team and all the various partners around it are constantly using this service to test it and to do test runs. And this is obviously creating a huge amount of noise. It's a bit like a crime scene where all the police officers are walking around leaving footprints everywhere. It means you can't tell the difference between which footprints belong to the police officers and which belong to the criminals. Although hopefully there's no criminals involved here, just users. So we had to try and find a solution to that, and Gunnar on our team came up with a really, really natty solution, which I really like. So basically, I've rather dramatically called it ghost mode here. It's not ghost mode, but it sounds a lot cooler if we call it ghost mode. So it's very quickly, in fact, I'll show you on here. So in the editor interface, so most members of the public will be using it just through a public link, but in the editor interface, which is where many of the officers and the team members might access this from, we've got a kind of special thing that comes up on the link, which is this sort of yellow bar saying, hey, analytics have been turned off. So what this does is it's added just a little bit to the URL, and it's creating a separate parallel service, which essentially means that it's leaving no footprints. Now, we can hide this bar, and we can also just, if we do decide we actually want to do that, we can turn that off. And now this is the main link that public users would see. And as I continue through this service, it would indeed be collecting analytics again. So yeah, that's a thing. It was a quite nice little solution that hopefully will improve our ability to get good quality data as members of the public start using the service. Another thread of work that we've been working on and are continuing to work on is, again, those of you who are following the general digital planning program and the digital planning effort will know about the work possibly that's being done by the digital land team at Deluc, which is very, very cool. So what they're doing is pulling together, they're making a kind of single source for pulling together lots of the data, the spatial data about things like planning constraints, such as conservation areas and listed buildings and things like that. So up until now, we've been having to kind of to do this kind of magic thing that users love of fetching this data instead of making everyone go and look it up. We've been having to basically make a highly bespoke thing with each council. And of course, every council at the moment has slightly different ways of publishing this data, et cetera, et cetera. So what they've been working on is this single source, which pulls together and aggregates this data and then makes it available through a single API. So we've been working, Jess on our team in particular, has been working with the team at Digital Land to try and get to a point where we can switch over and start pulling that data from their service. So this, what's on the screen now is it's the public interface, it's the visible bit, but of course behind the scenes there's also the API, which is where web applications can go to fetch the same data as well as humans. So I can't really show this, but we've got it. Most parts of it are running in a kind of an instance of the services. So we know that it seems to be promising and working well, and that's really cool. So yeah, pulling in exactly the same data, so we're getting the same kind of feature parity where we've got this big list of all the bits of planning constraints information that the current services currently need. But there are a couple of tricky bits still to solve. So we'll see that, and so it's not an immediate kind of, oh, finished and done just yet, unfortunately. So one of those things that we're still working through with them, we've got two things really. So one of them is Article 4 conditions, and those of you familiar with planning will know these are a slightly different type of thing. So things like conservation areas are standard, right? The meaning of conservation area is standard across the whole country, but Article 4s are policies that are put locally, and of course, one local planning authority might only have 5 Article 4 areas, and another might have 100. So it's harder to standardise. So this is one of the kind of tricky things that they're navigating, and we've got to find a solution to do that in a kind of generalisable way. And the other one, which is about more nuanced, which I won't go into too much now, of course, is there's a big difference between it sort of, if the service didn't tell us something positively was, but this hilarious thing about being positive about negatives, which sounds like I'm talking about COVID, but it's not, is like if a service, if we send off to the API and the API says, oh, well, it didn't tell us it was in a conservation area, there's still 2 possible outcomes. One is that it's not in a conservation area, and the other is that for some reason the request failed, or that information wasn't available. And of course, that's a really, really big difference in terms of RIPA and BOPs. Both the RIPA and BOP services really, really need to know that officers, so that officers can make kind of good decisions. So that's one of the things that we're going to have to find a way to work through. But hopefully once we can get through those, at some point we'll be able to start pulling our data from Digital Land. So that'd be cool. Another, just a couple of small ones, is decision points. And this came up through a few different bits of the kind of few different threads in when we were testing the services with users. So one is around journeys that are exempt a planning fee. So most people pay a planning fee, but there are certain situations, such as if the work's being done entirely for to help a disabled person, or if it's a resubmission where the service gives you the opportunity to say, oh no, this is actually a resubmission or whatever, and then you get no fee. And it had a kind of declaration, but users were a bit like, oh, I kind of prefer, I would like a much more clearer decision point about, okay, am I ready to submit? I'm ready to submit. So it's a kind of anxiety button in a way, but actually users like it because it's really clear what is the point of no return when you're about to submit. Normally that's done by the pay component, but without the pay component, you need some kind of equivalent point. So that's one just thing we've done here. So this is, for example, here we are, like I'm clicking the back button here. Let's say we've got this application here that someone's done. In this case, let's say no, if we said no, the works are not being done for a disabled resident, and no, it's not a resubmission, etc. Then when we continued on to this point, we would get a pay component. So a fee thing, which would then take us through to paying our fee. So we really want to just replicate the same experience effectively or something similar. If you're exempt, and it's to tell you why you're exempt. So if we just go back here and change our answers, and we'll say, yes, it is a resubmission. Well, we're going to have to answer a few more follow-up questions to really drill down. Wait a minute, is it a resubmission? Yeah, it's the first time I've resubmitted. And maybe I withdrew the original one and it was within the last 12 months, etc., etc. Maybe there's a reference number. I don't know what it would be. And now when we proceed, rather than just giving us these confirmations and then submitting here, it's doing this additional thing where it's confirming with the user, okay, the fee for this application is nothing, and here's why. And then, oh, are you ready? Here's your happy anxiety moment, I guess, hopefully happy. So that's a thing. And then the other kind of other version of this is also, there are other points variously in the services when often when they've seen when the user's seen a result, and this happens in both the find out if you need planning permission service and in the lawful development certificate. Obvious example is this. Here we are in Southwark's find out if you need planning permission service. So just before then, the user has answered a series of questions. In this case, I've already run this through, and there was a set of questions about skylight, installing some skylights. And happy days, in this case, the user has arrived at a point where it says, yeah, it looks like, based on the information you provided, it looks like this is permitted development, etc., etc. But the user's like, well, now what? There's a little kind of extra warning in here. But what we've added this little feature that allows us to add a little description to answers, which means that if a user, as is quite possible that a lot of people have never heard of, for example, a lawful development certificate, so they're not even aware that that service or that thing exists. But they do, they will use a service like find out if you need planning permission, for example, because that's a pretty plain English user need. So in this case, we're using this to introduce users potentially for the first time to the fact that that is a thing that they can do next. So it says, apply for a lawful development certificate. What's that? And so there's a bit of extra text. It's really helpful to be able to explain to users what that is and why they might want one. And hopefully this will be a kind of one of the really hidden benefits of using these digital dynamic services, is that in response to the journey that a user is taking, we can give them good advice and point them to where they want to be going next, and make sure that users are finding their way to the next service that can help them successfully continue their journey through the labyrinthine world of the planning system. And then very finally, we talked last time about the work that we've been doing on designing save and return, and in the interim, as well as starting to build a lot of that, so that development of that is well underway. Actually, it's not final. I've got one more thing, but we've just been doing some testing. Lamb's been testing this with some users, and that's just been really helpful just to get some kind of feedback on those designs before we get too deep into kind of building it. Because this it's really, really important that it's just kind of intuitive and obvious to people. Generally speaking, it's good news. I think all the users that we've tested it with so far have said, yeah, it's really, really clear. It's really obvious that I'll be able to save and return to this later and where I go to do that. There's some nuances here about agents and that they're kind of all, how do I manage having multiple applications at once? We know that using their inbox will be fine, but not perfect for them. We think this is one of the future opportunities for actually for the private sector here, is providing application dashboards that might do more than an email inbox to manage your applications. And some other kind of good feedback. So they liked having this extra link at the bottom, as well as going up the option to go up to the menu, this save and return to this application link later link at the bottom of every page, and a timestamp, which we might not do initially, but we will do at some point, which is just reassuring the user that it's being saved. And some other kind of key bits of feedback about, which I won't go into too much detail now, but about how long users have from when they start an application, if they kind of then neglect it, how long they have before it says, no, sorry, this is timed out. That's all to do with how we manage changes to the service, which we'll talk about on another show and tell, probably when we've built it. But it's really, really useful feedback to be getting those parameters from the users. And finally, this really is finally something so that, of course, we work in an agile way, because as Muhammad Ali said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So the best way that we can kind of communicate and share that is all the way through. We've had these public roadmaps, which take the form of these Trello things, so that these are completely public, so anybody at any time can see what we're working on and what we're working on next and what we've already worked on. But we were really, really aware that we've got these two. So we were really, really aware these are really in depth. So we have one, which is we imaginatively call our blue Trello, which is the design and development roadmap. So these are tasks that devs are working on. And then we have a green one, which is what we call our content roadmap, which is, if you like, what's the content of the services themselves. So the questions, the planning information, all of that stuff. But both of these are really granular. You can go in and have a look at them. There's really precise, loads and loads, huge amounts of work going on here, sweating really, really small stuff. And we were really aware that that's not necessarily very helpful for someone who's interested in following this work, but at quite a high level, doesn't want to really go straight into the weeds. So we've made a third one, which is we've called our high level roadmap. And again, you can go and check this out. And it's structured more simply off the back of, again, this is not a finished thing. It's a live, continuously evolving thing, but it's off the back of many conversations that we're constantly having across the project, where we're breaking the project into phases. And so you can see that over here in phase 1, you can roughly see that the things that we're working on are all the things I've just been talking about for the last 10 minutes. But you can also sort of see what's coming up in future phases of the work when we get to them, and what are the key milestones and what's the key focus of those phases, even if we don't know exactly precisely all the things that we'll encounter when we get there. So do go and have a look at this if you want to follow the project. The links to all three of those roadmaps are on ripper.digital, but definitely the high level roadmap is probably the most accessible of all of them. And with that, I will shut up and I will hand over to Alice.
Hello, thank you, Alistair. So today I'm going to share a bit of the work we've been doing on the content side of things, and specifically around our help text. Alice is going to be driving the slides for me, so I'm going to be saying next slide, please, a lot. So first of all, what is the help text? The help text you can find on the service. It's a little question mark at the moment. Perhaps it won't always be a little question mark, which you click on and it opens up a right-hand panel, if you're on a desktop, that gives a little bit more information about why we're asking this question. It can link off to a policy source. We know some users are very keen to dig into the details and read that kind of legislation. And we also have the possibility of a how is it defined section, which we can use to explain some of the more complicated areas that perhaps not all users will be familiar with. In this example, we've got the original house, and we've got a bit of a definition in there around what constitutes an original house. How do you find out which bit of your house is the original house and what that means? So Georgina and myself have been looking at this text and reviewing it over the last month. And it's really important that we get this right, because it's got to help people. If people are clicking on that button, then we've not answered their question, or they're a bit confused by what they've got on the screen. So it's really important that we kind of stop this potential frustration or confusion, and we kind of prevent people from making a mistake in the service. That's really important. And also at the most kind of severe level, it's stopping people getting so annoyed that they click away and don't bother using the service. So it's important that we get that right. And this task has been on our backlog for quite a while now, but we've never really prioritised it, because we know that not all users click on every single piece of this content, and we've really focused on the things that users definitely see and definitely interact with. But we decided to pick it up now in a big push to get the service as good as possible before we go into public beta. So we've spent the last month having a look at two things. Next slide, please. The first thing was the consistency. There were two things here that we picked out that were problematic. One was the link text going off to the policy source. Different people had created the content and written them in slightly different ways. And we wanted to make sure that this is standardized across the service. It's really unglamorous work editing these link texts, but it's really important because our service needs to be trustworthy and reliable, and making sure that we're consistent in how we present things will help build that sense of trust. The other thing we looked at were some common terms. There are certain things in the service that we talk about a lot and we define a lot. Things like what's a public highway, how do you identify the principal elevation of your house or the front of your house. I'm talking about that a lot, and because lots of different people have created the content, they've sort of written descriptions of this in slightly different ways. Now, their descriptions are all accurate and all good and in plain English for the most part, but because they're all a little bit different, we'd really like them to have some standardized bits of text that we can use that have been agreed by everyone. So when we're describing what a public highway is, we've just got the same text that we can drop in to each instance where we're talking about it. This has also been quite a laborious task. It's around identifying what these terms are, getting the plain English description, and then manually going through and dropping these descriptions in. But I think that's starting the hard work now, so that in the future, as we expand the services and things, we've got a bank of content that we can reuse in different places. Next slide, please. And the second thing we looked at was improving the language. And this is a really similar approach that we take the content across the whole service. It's got to be short, it's got to be simple, but it's particularly important in the help text. If you think about users are coming to this help text because they need help, you've really got to draw down and make sure that the content there is as simple and easy to understand as possible. So the two examples I've got here, I just pulled out one sentence that I was looking at yesterday. We've gone from a 20-word sentence, we've managed to cut it down to 7 words. Now, I guess on its own, that doesn't look like much, but if you can do that across the whole service, you're really reducing the time and the kind of mental energy it takes to unpick some of this wording. We're really hoping that for all users, this approach will help them get through and move on through the service as quickly as possible. So I guess with all of our content, we always we kind of do this work in the background, and then we'll test and iterate with users. And there's some really great things like when we've got the analytics coming through, we can look at which questions people are really clicking on the help text there. So that will help identify which bits we want to use, and seeing how people are, what they're doing after they've engaged with that help text. Lovely. And that's it from me. And I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to talk about prior approval.
Thank you very much, Alice. Yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, I'm going to be, first of all, hello, I'm Tom. I'm a designer working on the BOPS project, and I'm from Unboxed. And I'm going to be talking about prior approval, or applications for prior approval, and the process we're taking as we start to think about how we're going to be dealing with this type of applications across the whole project, but specifically looking at sort of the council side, how they're dealing with processing, meeting deadlines, etc., all the different needs that are associated with that. And I'll be talking through the research, some of the user needs we've identified, and then our approach to going through this minimum viable product process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So prior approval is the next type of application we are going to be thinking about as a project. But why is this? So like LDCs, or lawful development certificates, there are a set of national rules, and in fact they come from the same piece of legislation that defines a lot of the permitted development, for example, under lawful development certificates. But they involve increased complexity. So dependent on the type of prior approval application, there may be a variety of different consultations that need to take place. These consultations might take the form of neighbour letters, they might be consultations with internal experts, whether that's the waste team, highways, or environment agency in relation to flooding. And so we need to deal with this, which is going to be a recurrent theme as we sort of look forward much further into the future, into the sort of wider variety of different application types. These consultations is something that is key to the planning process. And they also involve a variancing process. So the way that you go through these consultations, or the way that you consider and what you have to consider, does change, and it is set out in this legislation. So there's a challenge there to deal with that variance, that process that needs to be followed for different planning officers, because it can be, there are quite a few different prior approval applications, and some of them are quite well used and some are not so well used. And so the familiarity of that can be a bit of a challenge, because there's a real need to not necessarily rely on knowledge, but go back and check, have we done things as it's set out in the legislation. Next slide, please. So we started this, so we knew what we wanted to do, but we first wanted to sort of understand a bit about how this was being experienced within the councils at the moment. So we spoke to a range of people performing different roles, people who are validating applications, people who are assessing applications, and people who are signing them off as well, to understand what the process is at their councils, what their goals are when they're trying to do it, what their frustrations are, and so we could build a picture of user needs and hopefully meet those needs in a way that works for the future. Next slide, please. And so from that user research, speaking to these people, asking them questions, getting them to take us through their process, we set out this range of user needs. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the ones I pulled out in bold. So for validators, there's a real need to respond to prior approvals quickly. A significant proportion of prior approvals have a time limit, which, if is not met, may mean that the case that might otherwise be refused could be given what is called deemed consent. So there's a real pressure to make sure that these are responded to quickly. As they drop into the inbox, they're immediately sort of picked off, and they're not done in order, as may be the case with other applications. They also need to be aware of the specific requirements. Are the documents there for this type of application? And because that can vary, the requirements, they need to be sort of aware of what it is that's being applied for, and therefore what needs to be provided. And it's often the role of validators to start consultations. Again, this comes back to the time limit, but they need to ensure that, if neighbours are required to be consulted, that all the neighbours are listed there, and that letters can be sent out. So it's not necessarily a case of using sort of an automated email system. There's a slightly higher level of complexity there, as it's a sort of need to physically send these things out to the addresses that they have on record. Next slide, please. For the officers, they'll need to be able to see the responses from these consultations, and they'll also need to know how long this consultation period has left. Once the consultation started, the case can't be closed. That period has to run, and there has to be a consideration of everything that's been collected over that period of time before it can be answered. So although there's a time pressure, there's also this period where it's kind of a bit in stasis. The officer can't jump in and make too many changes. They have a little bit less freedom, and almost in some ways a bit more pressure on their time. So they we want to help them by being able to meet this need to understand when can I action, what am I waiting for, has things come in, and what can I do from there. Next slide, please. And so the way that we've tried to meet all these user needs, and so we've also done some work on what the applicants' needs are, what the managers' needs are, what the consultees' different needs are in response to this. We started to map out these various activities, so starting work, validating, consulting, assessing, and tried to think about what are the different tasks that need to occur during this. And we've created this map of user stories to help us work out what's going to be our first pass through this. So if we go to the next slide, we'll have a detail of this around assessing an application. So we've got considering a consultation. So that's looking at the responses, working out what they say and how the officer needs to consider them. They need to think about the particular piece of legislation, in this case, the GPDO. Are they ticking it? Are they commenting it? Are they linking to other information? And they need to be able to make a decision. So they need to provide a reason for that decision, and they need to explain what it is, and we need to be able to record that. And then they need to send this decision out. So these tasks are broken down into whether that's emails, letters, the different things that the system might need to do to help meet these needs. Next slide, please. So as a wider team, we've been working on this question of like, how are we going to tackle this big problem? We know this is the next thing we want to do, and we're breaking it down by thinking about answering questions. So rather than trying to deliver all of these all of these features, kind of everything that's described on one of those little yellow post-its you saw on the previous slide, we're going to think about it in phases that answer different questions. The first question is, can we process a prior approval application? And so our focus is delivering all the minimum features that are needed so that a prior approval application can go through the service and be given a decision correctly. The next phase will be thinking about how we can reduce manual processes. So there's obviously quite a lot of manual processes potentially around consultation, whether that's sending letters out or identifying the right people to be consulted. We're going to be tackling that. How can we create a system that reduces that burden, makes it easier and quicker for the people involved? And then the third question is quite open-ended, is how smart BOPS needs to be about the legislation and requirements. Is it a case that we build a system that knows if someone is applying for prior approval for addition of an extra story on their house? Does BOPS know all the different requirements, and does that support the officer or the validator to make the assessment? Has everything been provided? Has the right types of consultations been done or not? And this, we don't know quite how this might work, and it may be the case that the answer is not very at this point, but we'll do some exploration, potentially building and testing on what we've already delivered to help us figure out this question as well. Thank you. So I think that's everything for me, and I will hand over to Stephen.
Thanks, Tom. So last week I tested a number of scenarios that a planner or validator might come across in BOPS with real staff at Lambeth, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the process I took to carrying out that testing. So the scenarios that I was looking at were involved two groups of tasks in BOPS. So those were withdrawing, returning, and then cancelling applications, and also manually adding a site plan polygon using the BOPS map feature. So for all of these tasks, we were looking at three things to see if the features are easy to find for users, whether the language used on the screen makes sense for the user, and did the user have any difficulty completing the tasks. So my sort of 4-step outline for that. So first I went over the scenarios and made test applications up using Ripper so that they get picked up in the BOPS system. At this point, I'm thinking about what documents might be needed by the participants to carry out the tasks. So for the drawing a map task, they needed to have PDF site plans, which they could translate into the service. And then also thinking about whether those tests should be more complex. So having a really simple map and then a more fiddly map for just testing the limits of how people get on. And then I took the tests applications in BOPS up to the correct state. So whether they needed to be made valid already for when the user was testing a particular thing, or if they didn't need to be started yet. For step 2, what is front of mind is whether finding and completing tasks in BOPs is easy and intuitive for the user. So part of answering this is testing the right tasks with the right people. And we can do this by selecting tasks based on what the user's role is and what they're most likely to come across. So at Lambeth, planning officers will almost never need to return an application, and they might not even be entirely sure what that means, and vice versa for withdrawing valid applications. So for those tasks, I only tested with the right people to get the most meaningful response. Some of the tasks are more universal and don't depend on roles, so all input that we get for that will be helpful. What about the drawing a map feature? Was this easy to pick up and easy to use both for planners and validators? To test this, I used participants with a range of experience, from long-standing members of staff to new starters. For the interviews, I set up video calls with the participants, and using screen shares, I watched them sign in and then get on with the tasks. I'd then explain the situation to the user. So, for example, you've been told the applicant mistakenly submitted this application and they don't want it to be progressed now. That was one of the scenarios. And when I'm explaining that, I'm avoiding the terms like cancel the application that are used in BOPs to check, because we're trying to see whether the language in BOPs does make sense to users. So I asked the participants also about what terms they would use to describe that task, and then how they would deal with the scenario they've been given based on what they can see on the screen. And then throughout that interview process, I'm taking notes. The final step is, after carrying out the individual tests with people, I check that my notes actually make sense so I can come back to them later. And when all the testing was finished, I write up the findings. So a very short summary of how the user got on and the key information about the participant, such as like what role they were and how much experience they have in that role. So all the findings from testing feeds into the team's understanding of what might need to improve in BOPs and how those improvements might need to be prioritized. So thanks for listening, and I'm handing you over to Ben and Evangelos.
Hey everyone, my name's Ben from Unboxed, and I'm a developer on the BOPs project. Apologies, due to some technical issues, I'm unable to share my own screen this morning, but Tom has very kindly volunteered to do some clicking on my behalf. Thanks, Tom. So let's just go into the validation wizard page. Click validate application and click start now. Cool, so just to give you a summary, if you joined us last time, you'll know that we discussed a big feature we've been focusing on recently, which is incorporating the validation wizard into the office's workflow. And so this has been designed and developed with ensuring the validation process, which is a really crucial part of the journey, is as straightforward and user-friendly as possible. And so we've now added the ability to validate the fee, check the constraints, create replacement document requests, and also create other validation issues. In the pipeline, we're working on adding the ability to add some missing document requests, and lastly, validating red line boundaries. And so the inclusion of displaying these different statuses attached to each of the rows in a task list means you have an easy oversight for what you've checked or not, and whether an action still needs to be taken. Any outstanding validation request sent to the applicant results in an invalid state, and the status of this request can be continually monitored throughout its life cycles. So there's probably a bunch of functionality we could go through, but I'll try to be prompt and show you just some of the highlights. And maybe after the demo, if anyone's interested in finding out more, then yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch. Okay, so let's just walk through validating the fee first. So if we click the link validate fee, we have a breakdown of the payment details for the application, and we can select if it's valid or not. So let's just start by making this one valid, just simply selecting yes and save. And now you can see the status is updated to reflect the valid state. However, if I go back into it and decide that it's actually invalid, I can select no and click save. And now I'll be taken to a form where I can put my reasons why I think the fee is invalid. I can put whatever reason I want. So maybe just payment is invalid. Yeah, or Tom, your reason's better than mine. That's good. And then, yeah, anything there will do. Obviously, you want to be as helpful as possible here in the real life case. So after all that, I can press add. And now I see the status of validating the fee is now invalid because it has an associated validation request. So if I click back into validate fee again, from here, I'm able to view the active request with a breakdown of its details. And if I want, I could edit the request. I'm also able to delete at this point too, in case I've made the request by mistake, but we won't do that now. But upon deletion, I'd be expecting the status of the validate fee task to return back to not checked yet, as I'm destroying the associated request. So Tom, if we just make the entire application invalid, so we get the notification. Perfect. Let's return back to the wizards. So if I click back into validate fee, I can see my open validation request, but now you'll see you don't have the option to edit or delete anymore because the applicant has now been notified. So from here, you're only able to cancel the request, which will also notify the applicant of the cancellation, and the status should return to not checked yet. But now let's take on the role of an applicant and reply to this validation request. So hopefully you should have got an email, Tom. Yes, so yeah, I'll click into that request and then just enter any reason or any response. Cool. Okay, so returning back to the main WhatsApp application, if we go back, we can see now we have an updated status. And if I go to view the validate fee link, now I can see the applicant's response. So from here, you can continue to validate the fee again, as demonstrated in the process we've just sort of been through. So maybe let's just mark this as valid and save. Perfect. Cool. So that's validate the fee. And with constraints, this is quite a bit more simpler because it doesn't depend on an interaction with the applicant, as we won't be creating a validation request. So you can simply go into the page and view the constraints. You have a link to update it, as well as just marking it as checked. So let's just mark it as checked. And so the idea of this is just, it gives you sort of a clear visual indicator that you've done your due diligence, and you can see the status is now checked. So that's all fine. Okay, so lastly, we'll run through validating the existing supplied documents on the application. So if you enter one of the links on these documents, you can see you can perform some edit functions, but the key thing here is you have the option to mark a document as valid or invalid at the bottom there. So let's just make this first one valid, save, and yeah, we can see that document has now been marked as valid. But let's say we have an issue with this other document. So we can enter the page again, and at the bottom there, we mark it as invalid. And now this should take you to a request a replacement document form, where you can enter a reason why you don't think this document is valid. And if we add that, so you can see the document is marked invalid due to the associated validation request. And if you re-enter the page for that invalid document, you can see the outstanding requests and the actions you can take. Again, this behaves similar to the fee item validation, where an applicant will be able to respond by uploading a new document. I don't think we'll bother just now, but this new document would enter as a new row in a task list of checking the supply documents, and you'll be able to repeat the same process, the same validation process for this new document again. So just to quickly summarize the other validation issues, we won't go through this bit, but just to say here that we have an option of adding any sort of miscellaneous or random request that isn't covered by the other sections. And so this will add a validation request to the planning application where the applicant is able to interact similarly to the other type of requests that we've demonstrated to you already. And so I mentioned at the start already, but we have 2 more sections still to add, but hopefully this will be added very shortly. And then the plan is to do a final cleanup of some of the UI elements and iterate on our validation request table, which will sort of act as the index of all the requests made with useful information such as whether it's been sent or overdue and so on. Okay, so that's all from me. Thanks for clicking for me, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Ben. So that's the end of our presentation for today, and thanks to all of our presenters for providing those updates. I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A box, and so far no one has asked any questions. So I wondered if we could open it up to the room if any of the partners have got questions for each other, or any comments that they want to make about the presentation or about the last 4 weeks of work. Or if no one has, then we'll just wait another few moments just in case anyone who's watching who does want to ask a question. If you just want to get that in as soon as you can, we'll just wait a few moments. I mean, just a general comment from me, it's really great, even as a partner, I'm working with everyone else on this call most days, but it's difficult to keep up with every single thing that each person's doing. So it's really great during show and tells to really get to see in detail what everyone else has been doing work on. So I've really enjoyed today's presentation. Okay, there's still no questions coming in. If no one in the room has got any questions, then I think we can close up at this point. So just to let everyone know, if you can just show the slides again, please, Alistair, just the final slide about the next show and tell. So the next show and tell is going to be on Wednesday, the 27th of April at 10 AM. So that's in a month's time. So get that into your diaries. And we hope you can join us again at that time to learn about the new updates for Ripper and Bobs. Again, on this slide, we have the project website, so you can visit those if you want to learn more. And we also have the contact details here for the partner councils in case you want to reach out to all of us or any one of us. That's our email addresses. And thank you very much for watching, and we hope to see you again next time.